So, welcome everyone to the Scenario Development and Eco-Ready webinar today. This is part of the Eco-Ready webinar series. This is webinar 13 of 15. My name is Nils Bunnefeld. I'm a professor at the University of Stirling, and here in the project I work on a secondment to alternate the science policy in Europe. And without further ado, we will have a look at the objectives and the objectives of this webinar. So this is really to recap on the role of scenarios in planning under uncertainty, to understand the different types of scenarios, exploratory, normative, policy relevant scenarios. We will together apply a structured framework to craft scenario narratives and identify key driver and uncertainties for scenario actions. We will use a simple tool, the 2x2 matrix, to map scenarios, and we will finish up with a wrap-up and the lessons learned. So we will go through what purpose and types of scenarios there are. We will have a look at frameworks and drivers. We will together do a driver mapping exercise, scenarios access selection and narrative drafting, build this 2x2 scenarios matrix, and then the wrap-up. That is what we're going to do cover today. So why do these scenarios matter? They are really interesting because we know already that we cannot predict the future precisely. This is more evident than ever now with climate change that affects biodiversity, that affects food production, food security, and all of these factors interact. So biodiversity, climate change, and food, they all interact, and therefore it is actually really difficult to predict the future exactly and precisely. So these scenarios allow us in a structured way to explore the multiple plausible futures. They can support strategic planning, they can do stress testing of policies and decisions, and eventually, they enhance our resilience by considering diverse risks and opportunities. So it's really all about thinking of the different ways that we can imagine the future and how we can get ready to deal, mitigate, and manage these potential futures and potential scenarios. So the most useful framework for this, I think, is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, where they very clearly state that scenarios and models can contribute significantly to policy support, even though several barriers have impeded their widespread use to date. So we see that it's very clearly acknowledged that scenarios could be more widely used, and they are not as widely used as they maybe would be useful, and therefore this is also in that way useful to have this webinar. They do need appropriate planning, investment, and capacity building to overcome challenges in developing and applying scenarios and models. And many relevant methods and tools are available, but they should be matched carefully with the needs of any given assessment or decision support activity, applied with care, taking into account uncertainties and unpredictability. So it's very clear that they are very useful, but that they need investment, and this is what we're doing in Eco-Ready. So scenarios are representations of possible futures for one or more components of a system. And they can incorporate these kind of drivers in change. For example, in natural dynamics, here in our case, climate change, biodiversity loss, food security, They can look at alternative policies, practices, management options, and they can incorporate uncertainties. So in a way, these scenarios are useful, but you can already get a feeling for the complexity of building these scenarios and all the different components that will go into it. This is a very useful way of looking at scenarios, I would say, from IPBES. And what you can see here is really on the outer ring, we can see the policy cycle. So if we start at the top right corner, we are designing policies, we're then implementing them, we are reviewing them, we then think about agenda setting and review this again to improve the design of policies. And this is a really simplistic way, of course, of looking at policy making and also adapting policies. But this is nevertheless useful because here we can see how the different types of scenarios fit into this cycle. So when you're thinking about designing policies, you might want to think about target-seeking scenarios. So we are in a situation, we have maybe analyzed past data, we're then moving to the present, and we have a very clear target. And then the scenarios will help us to get to that target that we want to be at in terms of, for example, food security, biodiversity, conservation, climate change mitigation. We set these future scenarios, we set these future targets, and the scenarios will then help us to think about different pathways. So one pathway, the red one, where we accelerate right at the start, but we're maybe kind of slowing down as we get closer to it. The other scenario, the blue scenario, where the bottom one, where we can see the start is very slow, but we are then accelerating towards the end. So these are very different ways of looking at this, and they are really important as we go through time when we're managing these systems and we're setting these policies, because we know what to expect, and maybe a slow start doesn't surprise us when we have gone through the scenario. So we're still confident that we're on track for reaching this target. Then as we move from the design to the implementation, we can see that we're using policy screening scenarios. So we're really thinking about, okay, so here are different policies, policy A, policy B, and they will take us on this journey into a certain direction. So it's not so important to evaluate the target. It's more important to look at where do these policies take us, and then we can maybe for that kind of future situation, the target in the future, we can compare how well our policies are doing compared to our target, and we can evaluate that in that way and see, well, are there certain policy scenarios that will hit the target, or which ones get closest to it, and so forth. So slightly different, but the point here is that these kind of policy screening scenarios are most useful when we're already in the implementation phase, which is true for many different policies. So we can still use scenarios in that phase of the policy cycle. We might then go to the review phase, and again, it might be useful to actually look at the retrospective policy evaluation, because it will help us to actually understand we are where we are, but we might want to understand where we are coming from and how the different policies could have maybe got us or what we would have predicted, and analyze that gap between the reality and what this policy was intended to do. Again, a bit similar to the policy screening scenario, because at the end of the day, we can evaluate the difference between where we are and where this policy was aimed at targeting. And the final one is, of course, the exploratory scenarios. So when we are setting agendas, that's a way of really exploring very different futures, very different exploring and predicting where certain policies would get us. So all in all, is very relevant for us in this kind of time of uncertainty, but also time when we have a lot of different interventions already, and we want to know whether these interventions work through the review and agenda setting. This is all well and good, but the important thing here is that, of course, we know that scenarios don't exist on their own. So scenarios are embedded in a much bigger system of scenario, models, decisions, policy. So if you go to the left-hand side, you can see that, yes, we have these scenarios describing plausible futures for indirect and direct drivers and policy options, and we talked about this already. And then we can see how this is embedded in the wider system. So, of course, we need data and knowledge that feeds into these scenarios. And that's exactly what we've done in EcoReady. We have worked with scientific knowledge. We have worked with local knowledge through the living labs and invited them to contribute to these scenarios. We have then thought about, okay, so if for all these scenarios and plausible futures, and the drivers that we identified, the policy options that we talked about, how would that feed into these models? And we used the magnet models and the LCA models to do this, and that was really done very nicely to then more formally actually predict these future scenarios. And that's really interesting because we are combining the data and the knowledge that we have on the science, but also local knowledge and experiential knowledge from the living labs, and fed them into the scenarios, fed them then into the models, and that will then allow us to work on a decision support interface or decision support tool, as EcoReady is doing. And finally, and that I said that already, we are in that phase at the moment where we are looking at policy and decision making. Of course, we're looking writing these policy briefs and summarizing the project in that way, and making it relevant for policymakers and also accessible to policymakers. So here there's the conceptual framework again for the intergovernmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and you can see how there are the direct drivers. In these scenarios, you can include the institutions and governance, nature benefits to people, good quality of life, and the scenarios slot into that kind of conceptual framework really nicely, because it deals with these kind of drivers, it feeds into the models and interacts with that kind of system. So this is, of course, not in isolation. You know, we talked already about the policy cycle, and again here this is a bit more detailed, conceptualized plan, implement, analyze, evaluate, and go around again. So these scenarios really fit very well into this whole framework, because we are now here assessing different types of scenarios, coming back to the exploratory, target seeking, the ex post assessment scenarios. We can look at a very wide range of direct drivers and indirect drivers, and they are really useful and applicable to our system as well. And then we're really looking at, in this case, this is again from the IPBES, impacts on drivers on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And I think that's a really interesting contribution from the EcoReady project, that it also adds here climate change and food security. So with any kind of method and any kind of approach, we really need to make sure that we are aware of the strengths. We talked a lot about strengths already, and I'd like to kind of summarize them here again, because we can see here that the strengths are becoming clear throughout this presentation. I think they really scenarios provide this opportunity, including diversity of stakeholders in the assessment process. It can be, and we will do a few exercises in a minute. We can use participatory methods here. We can include local knowledge and tacit knowledge, which is great. So we can, of course, use data and scientific knowledge, which is also important. But that mixture of knowledge is what makes these scenarios very, very strong and relevant. And they have a very flexible structure for analysis. We can adapt the method to various contexts. We can map out the steps needed to achieve a desired future outcome. And we can, as we've seen also in EcoReady very nicely, we can build quantitative scenarios. Of course, we can also build a narrative of scenarios, but we can integrate it with models, and that then provides very robust results. So they can be used for complex quantitative analysis of impacts with multiple inputs or outputs, and they really provide a nice fixed structure for analysis. And that allows us to repeat what we've done, to track what we've done, and then also make changes to this analysis and really understand and track the changes to the change in outcome to the change of the drivers that we put in. But as I said, it is really important with any method to think or approach to think about the weaknesses. And we have seen this really nicely in EcoReady. It is time consuming. We've had several project workshops, two of them. We first explored scenarios, we learned about scenarios, then we produced new scenarios. We met with the living labs and discussed all of this. And these are 1 to 2 day workshops. So it is time consuming. So it is, you have to make the time to build these scenarios properly, and to also engage in learning about scenarios with each other, especially if you have multiple and diversity of stakeholders. If you have less time, you can involve fewer stakeholders. As we say here, it's really trade-offs with the time for involving stakeholders. The more diverse you get, the stakeholders are in this approach, the more time you need. When you choose a qualitative approach, of course, we talked already about the quantitative scenarios, and they. We will come to the weaknesses next. But if you choose a qualitative approach, you should really think about the selection of suitable participants. So these people need to know what they're talking about. They need to be prepared. They need to be there needs to be a diversity of participants and stakeholders. Otherwise, you only get one view, and you don't fully capture the uncertainties and the different pathways of the scenarios and the diversity of the scenarios. Whether it's qualitative or quantitative, it requires substantial technical knowledge and capacity, as I already mentioned. So again, comes back to the selection of suitable participants. They need to have that knowledge and the capacity. They have to have the time to engage with it, and the prior knowledge before they come to these workshops. The data and information should come from a diverse and disparate set of sources. If you only collect it from one type of source, you your scenarios will not be able to reflect that kind of diversity that we need. And we talked about it before, that we really want to look at the different futures that we can explore. So for this, again, you need that diversity. And then specifically for the quantitative scenarios, yes, they are we have looked already at the strengths of this, but we also need to look at the risks and the weaknesses. So there's a really high risk that assumptions are not set, that they are not set out transparently, that we are not quite clear what the assumptions are of these models. Models are often complex, and for that it can be really difficult to know all of the assumptions and the risks. They often increase the requirements to have more resources. They increase the time that we have, the expertise and knowledge of the participants increases, and often people need to invest very heavily to understand what modeling approach we're using, and that can all mean that we increase the resource requirements a lot. And then, of course, as we have seen in EcoReady, the results depend on input data. So do we have, for example, one thing we were struggling with in EcoReady to some degree is, do we have really detailed biodiversity monitoring data for the region that we want to assess climate change and food security? Is that at the same scale, the data? These questions all came up very often, and more work needs to be done to really take care of this. So I will stop here with my sharing my screen, and I would like to invite you to and I will share my screen. Let me see. Because I think I can do both. Yes, there you go. So I would like to invite you to. I will just copy the link and put this in the chat, and it would be great if you could go to this here and add to this slide. We do a few of these exercises, let's say, and we'll have a look at it. What kind of different types of scenarios are you currently using, or which of the scenarios you think would be most useful for you? So this is just to collect a very short overview of what you think would be most useful. So we're going back to this. So if you could just add, if you go to the side and anything will do. So if you just put a little tick box, or you write it in, or you take another box here and you say something like A. That's what I've done now, or whatever is best for you. So just to get a feel from you what different scenarios. This is just free text. You can just add this to this. We'll just give a few minutes to get a feel for what different scenarios people are using. So, innovation foresight. So that's very interesting. Already, I added. So we've got policy testing. I added A, so I will delete that again because I'm not a participant, of course. We'll just give it a few more minutes and see which kind of scenario types people are using. So strategic planning, I think there's already policy testing, innovation foresight, I don't see any stakeholder engagement. I guess that comes back to the kind of capacity and the expertise that people need to bring to this. So strategic planning, yeah. So that comes up again. Brilliant. I think this moved a little bit. So. Okay, so I think that's already really interesting from those that are taking part in this webinar. So thank you for this. The next question I have for you is we will let me just continue with this. So we'll just go through, we won't spend forever on this, but we will have a look at the focal issue and the scope, identify key drivers and uncertainties, and do the matrix, the 2x2 matrix, and maybe think about a draft for narrative. So these are the scenario development steps, but maybe we won't go through everything in detail today. But what I would like to do is looking at some of the drivers that are especially important now for the kind of nexus of biodiversity, food security, and climate change. And what I would like to do here is to invite you again to have a look at the next set, which is if you just click, if you did like me, there's a 1 and there's a 2. And here we just put the drivers. And I mean, not so much drivers like climate change, of course, but more specific in your area or your policy context, or in your that could be market drivers, it could be drivers of what else do we have here, certain policies, and then we want to know, have they got high impact or low impact, have they got a high or low predictability factor, so again, just a couple of minutes would be great if we could spend on this, and add this, as you can just click here and then add the text box and say something like drought or food prices, or a specific policy that is driving this kind of change at the moment. So again, we'll just spend a few minutes to get a feel for the different drivers. And then I would add here high impact, high unpredictability, or high uncertainty. Yeah, we've got production input prices. Yeah, we've got that's a really good one. Climate change is definitely high impact and very high uncertainty, I would say. So. Okay, very good. So this is the first step in this scenario development, and you think about your different drivers, and yeah, we've got already climate change here. We've got production input prices, consumers is coming up here. So we've got the different, very different drivers and different impacts and uncertainties. So once we have done this, we have now done our mapping exercise, and we could then the next step would be to group similar drivers into the different themes and assess for impact and uncertainty. And you can go there much more detailed. Like if we had a day or two, we could really think about not only high and low, we could think about really making that much more clear and much more detailed what the impact on and the uncertainty is. So the last bit of today, we will produce a 2x2 scenario matrix, and I think that's really interesting because I have here taken an example here from Foresight for Food, and here you can see how we have high climate change impact and we have low vulnerability to shocks. And we can then look at the different scenario blocks. So we can look at climate proofed, complacent growth, risky, climate crisis. So really when high climate change impact and high vulnerability, that is where we're talking about kind of climate crisis. And therefore you can use this matrix to do this. And I invite you very briefly here, or if you want, to think about what were the ones we had. We had input prices and we have climate change. So we want to maybe change this. I prepared this already. And in a similar way that we thought about, and from this example, we want to think when it goes from input prices high to low, what are the different, and then we can start to build these kind of scenarios. So we got input prices high here and climate impacts high. And that would allow us now to populate this to go from low to high. And again here from low to high, and this would allow us to develop these kind of narratives in a similar way that we can see this here. So then we really start to think where do these scenarios go, and we're building these scenarios across these axes and think about just two aspects for now, which is I think interesting because it's again very much a simplification of this very complex matter. You can imagine that scenarios could have many more dimensions, but for now, this would be a 2x2 scenario matrix that we could work on as a group. If you wanted to think about this, and it would be nice to do this for a few minutes. I'll make this a bit smaller so we can see on our screen both. So you also can still see the example here. So we would kind of can think about if input price is high and the climate impacts are high, this is probably where we have, so it's a little bit the opposite side from the other one, but this is probably here where we have something like the climate crisis, climate and probably when the input prices are high, climate and food security crisis. Right? So we could start to think about what these things mean, especially when we get here to the input price is very high, but the climate impacts are rather low, and so forth. So we are similar to the example. We could start to populate this and think about different scenarios. Okay, I think that illustrated the different steps really nicely, and you're welcome to go back to this exercise, of course, any time. But I think for the interest of time, we're just going to wrap up for today. We can now start to really think about the storyline. So I think it's really interesting how the scenario development can go in both directions. You can think about, of course, the modeling the scenarios. And as we said already, it's very good because we can be very quantitative, we can model this, but then downside is it will take a lot of expertise. Whereas here we've got the narrative drafting, we can think about it in a qualitative way, which also needs expertise and investment, but it's a very different set of expertises that we need for this. But for each of these quadrants, we could now think about a short storyline describing the environment and the key features, maybe indicate stakeholder roles and priorities, and highlight major risks and also opportunities. So we could complement this with a SWOT analysis, which then really highlights the weaknesses and opportunities and the threats and the strengths also, of course. So we could then think about in the next step of the exercise or going through this scenario development, really thinking about developing a brief narrative for each of the quadrants, identifying key implications per scenarios, and then really sharing this quadrant's narrative. And this is in a way what we have done in EcoReady. And then the next step, which we have also done in EcoReady, is to identify the common threats and the strategic options. Then assess the robustness of these strategies across all the scenarios, and then identify early warning indicators for each of the future scenarios. So to take away from this, a few kind of ideas about best practice and tips. We really want to involve a diverse set of stakeholders very early. We want to document assumptions transparently, limit to few high impact uncertainties, iterate narratives as insights emerge, and use visuals to communicate effectively. So these are some, I really think that the involving of the diverse stakeholders early is really, really important. It should not be an afterthought. It is really probably the most important tip and best practice. Scenarios are great for allowing us to view possible futures. We can apply a very structured way of doing this that ensure clarity and focus. We can use tools like the 2x2 matrix. It is simple, it's powerful, it has its limitations, of course, as well, especially for a project like ours, which also includes more than 2x2, which is, of course, food security, biodiversity, and climate change. So we would need to expand a tool like this. It's really good, actually, in a way that we can use narratives. And narratives is something that people relate to, that a diverse set of people understand and can work with. So this is really good for translating abstractions into actionable insights. And scenarios can then guide resilient strategy development and can be reviewed, can be redone, and therefore really support an adaptive management and the adaptive policy cycle. So the next webinars will be AI and food security applications and policy planning and roadmap to resilience. So they are still coming up in our sessions. I'll thank you for taking part in this and joining me for this webinar. And just open the floor for any questions.